"What's the matter, old man? Cat got you tongue?" The punk sneered, stepping closer, towering over the veteran in the wheelchair. The coffee shop went dead silent, every pair of eyes darting between the bully and the man with the prosthetic leg. The veteran's hands trembled on the wheels, but he didn't move. He didn't have to, because from the far corner of the room, a chair scraped back. No words, no warning. Chuck Norris stood up, calm, unshaken, and the air in the coffee shop turned colder than ice. What happened next, nobody saw coming. Welcome to Chuck Norris Heroics. Let's uncover what really happened. The soft hum of the coffee shop filled the air, a familiar soundtrack to the morning rush. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans mixed with the faint aroma of warm pastries, creating a cozy atmosphere. The barista behind the counter, a young woman with a friendly smile, called out orders as the steady buzz of conversations blended with the clink of coffee cups. The door opened and closed with a gentle chime as customers came and went, seeking a moment of calm before the day took hold of them. At his usual corner table, Rick sat quietly, his weathered face soft but tense, as he carefully arranged his belongings. His prosthetic leg rested on the floor beside him, a silent reminder of the battle scars he carried with him daily. He shifted in his wheelchair, adjusting his position to feel more comfortable. There was a calm to this place, a stillness he treasured in a world that often felt too loud, too chaotic. The veteran support group was no longer meeting at the community center, so he had found a quiet peace here in the mornings, sipping his coffee and reflecting on the battles he had fought, both in war and within himself. He wasn't looking for attention, never had, but sometimes in moments like this when the world moved a little slower, he could almost forget the weight he carried. He had learned, over the years, to live with the silence, the painful memories, the loneliness that came with his service, but in the small corners of places like this, it didn't feel so heavy. He watched the young barista as she handed a cappuccino to a couple who sat in the corner booth, laughing softly as they shared stories of their day. He could almost hear the sound of their voices, untroubled by the noise outside, by the world's discontent. It was a peaceful morning, until the doors swung open again, and the day would begin to shift in a way Rick never expected. The door swung open with a jingle, and a group of young men entered the coffee shop, their loud voices quickly filling the room. They were a mix of students and early 20-somethings, wearing sports jerseys and baseball caps, their laughter carrying across the space. They walked up to the counter, greeting the barista with exaggerated enthusiasm, making jokes that seemed more aimed at the crowd than the woman behind the counter. Rick didn't mind the noise at first. It was part of the everyday life in the shop. He tried to keep to himself, focusing on the warmth of his coffee and the quiet hum of the espresso machine. But then, one of the men, a tall guy with a cocky grin, caught sight of him from across the room. His voice rose above the chatter, carrying through the air with a mocking tone. "Hey, check this out, guys," the man said loudly, pointing at Rick. "You see that guy over there? You think he's a war hero or something? Look at him, sitting there like a statue." The group chuckled, some half-heartedly, while others seemed to laugh a bit too loudly, egging him on. Rick's hand tightened around his coffee cup, the warmth offering little comfort. He had heard these kind of comments before, not just here, but in countless other places, and yet it never got easier. The tall man took another step closer to Rick's table, leaning in with exaggerated curiosity. "Hey, buddy, what happened to you? Don't look like you could stand up if someone asked you to." The group laughed again, a few clapping each other on the back as though they had just delivered the funniest punchline. Rick felt his heart race, the old reflexes kicking in, the ones that told him to fight back. But instead, he kept his gaze on his cup, trying to steady his breathing. He wasn't going to engage. He couldn't. Not today. But as the laughter continued to rise, he could feel the weight of their words settling on his shoulders, heavier than any battle he had ever fought. Rick's fingers gripped the edges of his coffee cup a little tighter, the warmth no longer offering comfort, just a reminder of the tension slowly rising in his chest. The laughter from the group of young men echoed in his ears, each word like a jab he couldn't avoid. He knew they didn't understand, but that didn't make it any easier. They had no idea what it was like to wake up each day with a body that didn't feel like it belonged to you anymore. They couldn't possibly know how it felt to carry the weight of memories that haunted your every step, that made even the smallest tasks feel impossible. He wanted to snap, wanted to stand up and say something. Anything to make them stop, to make them understand that the leg they were mocking wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was the physical reminder of a fight he had lived through, a fight that had cost him more than he could ever explain. But the words never came. The anger, the frustration, the pain, they all swirled inside him, a storm he couldn't release. The worst part was how familiar it all felt. He had faced similar situations too many times before, people who saw the prosthetic, saw the wheelchair, and immediately assumed they knew his story. They didn't see the years of service, the bonds forged in the heat of battle, the friends he had lost along the way. All they saw was what was in front of them, a man who didn't quite fit into the world anymore. Rick took a slow breath, trying to center himself. He wasn't some kind of charity case. He wasn't some broken thing to be mocked or pitted. But every laugh, every snide comment chipped away at the armor he had spent years building. He had survived wars, but this was different. It wasn't a fight he could win with fists or firepower. It was something that crawled under your skin, a quiet kind of cruelty that made you question if your presence even mattered. As the laughter continued, Rick's thoughts raced. But still, he stayed silent, hoping they would move on, hoping they would leave him in peace. The sound of the coffee shop door chimed again, but this time it was different. Rick didn't need to look up to know who had walked in. The room seemed to quiet down just for a moment, as if the entire atmosphere shifted to make way for the new arrival. It wasn't the way the noise from the group of young men had instantly filled the room. This was something else, a presence that felt almost weighty in its calmness. Chuck Norris stepped into the shop, as unassuming as ever. His presence was commanding, but there was nothing showy about it. He didn't draw attention to himself. He simply moved with purpose, walking toward the counter with an easy, deliberate stride. His dark jacket, casual yet impeccable, and his composed demeanor seemed to radiate a quiet strength that drew every eye without a single word being spoken. Rick's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't that he was a fan, though like most, he had seen Chuck's movies and admired his unbreakable image on screen. It was that, in this moment, Chuck was real. He was a person walking into this very coffee shop, not a Hollywood legend, but a man like Rick with his own quiet burdens. Chuck approached the counter and greeted the barista with a simple nod, his voice soft but firm as he ordered as usual. It was a small, seemingly insignificant interaction, but to Rick, it was almost surreal. There was no entourage, no flashing cameras, nothing grand. Just a man who moved with the ease of someone who had been through the fire and walked out the other side, still standing. Rick's eyes followed Chuck as he moved to an empty table in the corner, sitting down with his coffee. He didn't make a show of it. He simply sat, the world around him buzzing with noise, yet he appeared as calm as a still lake. Rick felt a strange sense of comfort wash over him, like maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. In the midst of the chaos, there was someone who understood what it meant to carry the weight of the world and still find a quiet place to rest. The noise in the coffee shop grew louder as the group of young men became more emboldened. They had already laughed at Rick, but now, the taunts were turning darker, more personal. The tall one who had first started the mockery leaned in closer, his voice carrying across the room. "You know," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I bet he's not even a real vet. Just some guy trying to get attention." The others snickered, clearly feeding off each other's energy. The group was no longer just mocking Rick's prosthetic leg. They were attacking his service, his dignity. It felt like a slap to the face, each word landing like a punch. Rick's grip on his coffee cup tightened, but he didn't move. He couldn't. He was trapped in a battle of his own, fighting to keep his anger under control. It was one thing to be mocked for something he couldn't control, but to be questioned about his service, that was a line he had never been prepared to cross. "Yeah, look at him," the tall man continued, a smug grin plastered on his face. "Bet you couldn't even stand up if you tried." "Huh? What a joke." Rick could feel his blood boiling, the urge to stand up and defend himself so overwhelming that it nearly hurt. But as always, he stayed seated. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him react. That was their game, push him to the breaking point and watch him snap. But he refused. He'd fought too long to keep his composure, even if it was the hardest fight of all. The laughter from the group grew louder, and for a moment, Rick felt completely alone. That's when Chuck's calm presence became more pronounced, his gaze still fixed on the group, unwavering and unspoken. The air around him seemed to crackle with tension, as if he, too, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Without a word, the tall man noticed Chuck watching from the corner of the room. He stepped closer to Rick, eyes now glinting with something more than mockery, a challenge. "What? You just gonna sit there like a coward? Or are you gonna stand up, tough guy?" Rick couldn't help it. His hand shook slightly as he set the coffee cup down. Something was about to give. The laughter in the coffee shop seemed to grow, louder and more cutting with each passing second. Rick's heart hammered in his chest, his pulse rising with every mocking word thrown his way. He had trained himself to ignore the jeers, to turn the other cheek, but this was different. It was as though they were daring him to react, daring him to break, to prove them right about everything they assumed. But then, in the middle of it all, something shifted. Chuck Norris hadn't moved, not since he had entered the shop, but now, Rick could feel it. A subtle change in the air, a quiet strength that radiated from across the room. The young men were still mocking him, but their voices faltered just for a moment, as if they were finally aware of someone else in the room. Chuck's gaze never wavered from the group. It was steady, unflinching, as if he had already sized them up and found them wanting. His presence was undeniable, like a mountain standing still in the midst of a storm. The young men were too caught up in their own bravado to notice, but Rick could sense the shift. The confidence the bullies had been feeding off now seemed to wane, and the energy in the room felt different, charged with something more than just the usual noise of the coffee shop. Rick could almost hear Chuck's calm thoughts without him having to say a word. Chuck had lived through battles of his own, fought wars that didn't always involve enemies with guns or fists. His strength was in his restraint, in his ability to stand silently in the face of chaos and not give in to it. The tall man, emboldened by his friend's laughter, took another step toward Rick, but this time, something was different. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply locked eyes with the young man, his presence alone an unspoken challenge. It was as if Chuck was daring him to continue, daring him to test the difference between arrogance and true strength. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Rick's grip on his wheelchair tightened, but he didn't speak. There was no need. Chuck had already said everything with a look. The storm was about to hit, but Rick didn't need to fight anymore. The unseen hero was already standing tall, without saying a word. The tall man, undeterred by Chuck's steady gaze, took another step closer to Rick's table. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rick could feel his muscles tighten, his breath shallow, as the mockery continued. The young man's face twisted with smug satisfaction as he leaned down, looking Rick over with a sneer. "You think you're tough? You think you've earned some kind of respect?" The man spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Look at you. You're just a broken old soldier with a fake leg." Rick's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could feel his heart pounding, a familiar rush of adrenaline coursing through his veins, tempting him to stand up, to fight back. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He had learned, over the years, that it wasn't always about striking back when provoked. The real battle was in silence, in holding onto your dignity when others tried to tear it away. For a long, drawn-out second, Rick considered what to do. The taunts were unbearable, but Chuck had done something without a word, without even a move. Rick was reminded of that quiet strength, and it steadied his resolve. He refused to let this moment become just another one of those lost battles, another example of giving in to the cruelty of others. Chuck didn't need to speak. His silence was the answer to everything. Rick looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time, and saw nothing but calm. There was no anger in Chuck's eyes, no irritation, just that unshakable composure that came from a life lived in balance, not chaos. The tall man, sensing the shift, finally straightened up, looking to the crowd for support, but found none. He had pushed too far, and now, in the face of Chuck's quiet strength, his bravado crumbled. The crowd, once split between laughter and discomfort, now grew still, waiting for something to break the tension. Rick's breath steadied as he realized that he didn't have to say anything. Sometimes the quietest moments carry the most weight. Rick sat in his wheelchair, his gaze fixed on a young man in front of him, feeling the weight of every insult like a physical blow. The laughter still hung in the air, but it was thinner now, no longer as sharp as the young man faltered. The silence stretched on, heavy with expectation. For a brief moment, Rick wondered if he should stand up, if he should do something, anything, to regain his dignity, to show them that he wasn't some easy target. He could feel his hands trembling on the armrests, the old reflexes kicking in, the ones that had been drilled into him during years of service. The instinct to fight back, to defend himself, to prove his worth, surged up inside him like a tidal wave. He had always been the one to fight back, to stand tall in the face of adversity. But that was before everything changed. That was before the war, before the injuries, before the loss. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't a fight he could win with strength or force. Rick wanted to respond, to tell the young man exactly who he was, to remind him of the sacrifices made and the battles fought. But the words caught in his throat, tangled with frustration and self-doubt. Who was he anymore? The man he used to be, the soldier who stood tall and proud, seemed like someone from a lifetime ago. His gaze drifted to Chuck, still standing in that corner, calm and composed, as if he had already won the fight. No words, no threats, just presence. And that's when Rick realized something. The real strength didn't lie in the ability to stand and fight. It lay in choosing not to, in holding back, in not letting the cruelty of others drag you down. The inner battle raged within him, but in the end, Rick stayed silent. The silence wasn't a surrender. It was his power, his choice. And for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it was enough. The room seemed to hold its breath, the noise of the coffee shop silenced by the weight of the moment. Rick's eyes were fixed on the young man, still standing in front of him with that smug grin, waiting for a reaction. But Rick didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't speak. He just sat there, calm and steady, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. His hands, once trembling, had steadied now. The young man, his bravado growing thinner by the second, took another step closer, his voice louder, almost desperate. "What's the matter, old man? Scared?" he taunted, as if daring Rick to do something. But Rick didn't budge. He was no longer trying to hold himself back. He had found something more powerful than his urge to fight back. He had found peace in his silence. Chuck Norris had been right all along. Sometimes it wasn't about words. It wasn't about proving yourself to others. It was about letting your actions, your presence, do the talking. Chuck hadn't stood up to make a scene or prove his worth. He had done it because he knew the power of quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Rick's gaze shifted ever so slightly to Chuck, who sat there with a quiet dignity, watching the scene unfold. There was no need for Chuck to intervene. He knew, just as Rick did, that the power to control the situation lay in Rick's hands, not through physical force or words, but through the simple act of not reacting, of choosing in that moment to stand tall without ever standing up. The young man's expression began to falter, his bravado cracking as the silence stretched. The crowd, which had been so eager for the spectacle, began to sense the shift. Some looked uncomfortable, others unsure of how to respond. Finally, the young man took a step back, his shoulders slumping, the cocky grin fading from his face. He looked around, searching for support, but found none. Rick's silent stand had stripped him of his power. Without a word, the young man turned and left, the room falling into an uneasy quiet. Rick sat there, calm, composed, and unbroken. The young man, now standing several feet away, was no longer the one in control. His mocking grin had faded, replaced by a look of uncertainty. He glanced nervously around the coffee shop, but no one met his eyes. The silence hung thick, stretching the tension into a suffocating stillness. Chuck's gaze never wavered. He had yet to speak, but it was clear that his presence alone was enough to command the room. His eyes locked onto the young man with a calm intensity that felt almost unnerving. It was a stare that didn't need words. It was a stare that told the young man exactly what he needed to know, that his mockery had no power here, that his arrogance was misplaced. Rick could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The young man was no longer just a source of annoyance. He was a man who had pushed too far, who had underestimated the kind of strength that didn't rely on aggression or noise. The veteran in the wheelchair and the legendary fighter across the room had both made their stands, silently and unwaveringly, and the young man was left to confront the weight of that silence. The young man's breath quickened, his posture becoming less sure as he stood in the middle of the room, caught between the crowd's growing discomfort and the quiet intensity of Chuck's stare. He had started this with bravado, with loud words and insults. But now, in the face of something much greater, he was uncertain. Chuck's eyes didn't flicker. There was no sign of impatience, no sign of anger. It was as if he was waiting for the young man to come to terms with the truth of the moment. That strength, real strength, didn't need to be flaunted. It didn't need to announce itself to the world. It simply was. Rick watched the young man's shoulders slump, his chin lowering as the fight went out of him. He had lost, but not in the way he thought. He had lost to the quiet strength of two men who had nothing to prove. And without a word, he turned and walked out, the weight of his defeat echoing in his footsteps. The room remained still. The door swung open with a soft jingle as the young man, now visibly defeated, walked out of the coffee shop, the weight of his arrogance crumbling with every step. The murmurs in the room slowly grew into a hum, but the air was still thick with tension. No one spoke, but all eyes remained on Chuck and Rick, as if waiting for something more to happen. Rick's heart still raced, the remnants of anger and frustration lingering in his chest. He had held back, stayed silent, and in doing so, he had regained something he hadn't even realized he'd lost. His dignity, his sense of self. But the moment wasn't over yet. He could feel it, the change in the air. The quiet stand had been made, but now, Chuck's presence seemed to have left something behind, a charge that remained unspoken. For a long moment, no one moved. The noise of the coffee shop seemed to have faded into the background, leaving only the steady, rhythmic sound of Chuck's breathing, calm and measured. His gaze, however, was still fixed on the door, as if he were waiting for something too. Then, without warning, Chuck stood up, his movements deliberate and slow, each step heavy with intention. His eyes shifted to Rick, and for the first time since the commotion began, Chuck spoke, his voice low and steady. "Let's go," he said simply. Rick looked up, surprised. He hadn't expected Chuck to say anything, let alone ask him to move. But there was something in Chuck's tone, something in the way he said it, that told Rick it wasn't just an invitation. It was a moment, a shift in the balance. Rick hesitated for a second, his thoughts racing. The rest of the room seemed to disappear, leaving just him and Chuck standing in the midst of the aftermath. Then, with a steady breath, Rick nodded. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew something had just shifted, not only in the coffee shop, but in himself. As he pushed his wheelchair forward, the door swung open once more, the bell chiming softly behind them. This time, it wasn't just a man walking out. It was a statement. As Rick wheeled himself toward the door, he felt an unfamiliar weight lift off his shoulders. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness that had clawed at him moments ago began to fade into something deeper, something quieter. The soft jingle of the door as it opened was a simple sound, but to Rick, it felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter he had been struggling to write for years. The cool air of the morning hit his face as they stepped outside. He didn't know what to expect next, but somehow, Chuck's quiet strength had provided him with something he hadn't had in a long time: clarity. In the midst of the chaos, the mockery, and the discomfort, he had realized something about himself, something he had been fighting to admit. For years, Rick had tried to prove himself, to others, to the world, and maybe even to himself. He had let people's judgments define him, their words shaping the image of who he was. But Chuck hadn't fought back with words or force. He hadn't needed to. He had stood there, silent, and in doing so, he had shown Rick that true strength wasn't about responding to every insult or challenge. It was about standing firm in who you were, regardless of what others thought or said. Rick's hand moved to his prosthetic leg, his fingers grazing the smooth surface, and for the first time, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel shame. He felt a quiet pride in who he was, in what he had overcome. The leg, the scars, the battle, none of it defined him unless he let it. He glanced up at Chuck, who was walking ahead, a calm figure in the bustle of the world around them. The man didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. Rick realized then that it wasn't about fighting back or winning. It was about knowing your worth, even when others didn't. Rick smiled to himself, the first genuine smile in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he was finally learning what it meant to truly be free. Rick and Chuck walked in silence for a few blocks, the world moving around them, but somehow it felt like time had slowed. Rick's mind churned with the events of the morning. He could still hear the laughter echoing in his head, feel the sting of their words. But now, in the quiet of the street, he found himself asking the question that had been nagging at him since he first met Chuck's gaze. Had he really changed? Was he truly different from the man who had once been so eager to prove himself, to fight back at every turn? As they neared a quiet park bench, Chuck stopped, turning to face Rick. The air between them felt charged, but there were no more words needed. Rick could feel it. This was the moment, the test he hadn't anticipated. He had spent so much time wondering if he could ever go back to who he was before the war, before the loss. But now, he realized the test wasn't about returning to something he had once been. It was about facing the man he had become. "Sit down, Rick," Chuck said quietly, gesturing toward the bench. Rick obeyed without hesitation, his hands resting lightly on the wheels of his chair. For a long moment, there was only silence. It wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settled deep in your bones like the quiet after a storm. Rick could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, but it didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like something he could carry, something he was finally ready to carry. "Every day's a test," Chuck said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. "But it's not about proving something to anyone else. It's about proving it to yourself, how you handle things, how you choose to move forward." Rick nodded slowly, the truth of Chuck's words sinking in. This was the ultimate test, not one of strength or action, but of resolve. And as he sat there, looking out at the quiet park, he realized he was ready for it. Ready to prove, not to others, but to himself, that he could move forward, that he could truly be free. The bench creaked softly under the weight of silence. Rick sat with his hands resting on his knees, his mind still sorting through the events of the morning. Chuck sat beside him, just as calm, as unruffled as ever. It was strange to Rick how someone could be so at peace with themselves in the face of everything. It was a kind of strength that was foreign to him. For a long while, neither man spoke. The city's noise seemed far away here, the sound of cars and people reduced to background hums. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the nearby trees, adding a sense of movement to the stillness around them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but rather it felt like a necessary pause, like they were both absorbing the weight of the world in their own quiet ways. Rick turned his head slightly, glancing at Chuck from the corner of his eye. There were so many things he wanted to ask, so many things he wanted to say. He could feel the words stirring inside him, but they weren't the kind of words that could be put into a sentence. They were more like thoughts, raw, unrefined, still making their way through the maze of his emotions. The gratitude, the confusion, the awe. He felt all of it in equal measure, but he didn't know how to express it. Chuck, as if sensing Rick's inner turmoil, turned his gaze toward him, his eyes steady, calm, and knowing. He didn't need to speak. It was as if he had already understood everything that Rick was feeling, everything that Rick was struggling to come to terms with. There was no judgment in Chuck's eyes, no need for an explanation. Just the simple acknowledgement that Rick didn't have to say anything. The quiet stretched between them like an unspoken bond, two men who didn't need words to communicate. In that moment, Rick realized the truth wasn't always found in spoken phrases. It was in the silence, the understanding that passed between them, the unspoken words that told him everything he needed to know, that he was not alone, that he could keep moving forward just as he was. The day wore on, and the world around Rick and Chuck began to stir again. People walked by in a steady stream, some with hurried steps, others more leisurely, but none of them seemed to notice the two men sitting on the park bench, lost in their own thoughts. Yet, something was changing, something subtle that Rick couldn't quite place. The weight of the morning still lingered, but now there was a quiet shift in the air, as if the energy of the coffee shop had spilled out onto the streets. As Rick wheeled himself slowly down the sidewalk, he noticed something different. The same young men who had taunted him earlier now walked by. But this time, they didn't look at him. They didn't sneer or laugh. They didn't even glance his way. Instead, they kept their heads down, avoiding eye contact, moving quickly, their shoulders a little hunched, as though they were trying to escape something they hadn't expected. It wasn't just them. The people walking past seemed to take notice of the silence that hung around Rick and Chuck. The usual noise of the busy city, the chatter and the honking, all seemed to fade into the background. Instead, people slowed their pace as they passed by, casting small, almost imperceptible glances at Rick, some offering a nod, others simply pausing for a second, their eyes acknowledging him in a way they hadn't before. Rick didn't understand it at first. It wasn't like the world had suddenly changed, or that everyone around him had seen some grand transformation. But there was a palpable shift, like the energy in the crowd had softened, just enough for people to stop and notice what had been there all along. Not the man in the wheelchair, not the scars or the prosthetic leg, but the quiet strength, the dignity, and the presence that Chuck had shown. The moment had passed in the coffee shop, but it wasn't over. The crowd was different now, subtly altered, as if they had all witnessed something, even if they hadn't been aware of it. And in that small shift, Rick felt a quiet sense of victory. Not one he had to fight for, but one that had been earned without a single word. Rick felt a steady calm as he wheeled himself through the streets, the soft rhythm of the wheels against the pavement almost meditative. The city around him moved as it always did, filled with noise and life, but it felt different now. The weight of the morning's tension, the mocking, the chaos, had faded into the background, and in its place was something else, a quiet strength, like the calm before a storm. He didn't know exactly when the change had begun, but he felt it now. He could still hear the voices of the young men, their insults echoing in his mind, but it didn't sting the way it had. It was like those words had no power over him anymore, as though they had been absorbed into the stillness he had found. Rick had lived with the shadow of his past, the quiet loneliness of being judged and misunderstood, but something in Chuck's presence, in the way he had silently stood up for him, had changed the rules. The final test had come, not in the form of a challenge or a confrontation, but in the choice to stand firm without moving, to rise above the noise. Rick had held his ground without ever lifting a fist, without ever giving in to the anger or bitterness that had so often defined his past. He hadn't needed to fight. He just needed to be. As they approached the park again, Rick could see the quiet nods of acknowledgement from the people passing by. The shift had happened, and it wasn't just within him. There was a change in the air, in the way people moved around him, in the way they saw him. No longer just the wounded soldier, the broken veteran, but a man who had earned his place not by force, but by his unwavering presence. When they reached the bench again, Rick paused, his hands resting on the wheels of his chair, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of the world lift, if only for a moment. The real battle wasn't in the fight. It was in choosing to stand, to exist, with nothing but quiet dignity. And in that moment, he knew he had won. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the park as Rick and Chuck sat in quiet contemplation. People passed by in a blur, some noticing them, some not, but Rick felt a sense of peace settling over him. He had learned something vital in the last few hours, a lesson he had fought for, but never truly understood until now. Then, Just as the stillness was becoming too familiar, a familiar voice pierced the calm. It was a sharp, familiar tone, unmistakable in its arrogance. "Hey, look who it is. The war hero and his buddy." The young man's voice cut through the park, and Rick's body stiffened. He recognized the sound of mockery instantly, the same taunts that had plagued him before. Rick's breath hitched as he turned toward the voice, his mind instantly on alert. The young man was back, walking briskly toward them, his friends trailing behind, still laughing like the world owed them something. Rick's hand instinctively reached for the armrests of his wheelchair, but Chuck was already moving. Without a word, Chuck stood, his presence commanding the space around him like a wave building before crashing. Rick watched as the young man approached, his posture full of cocky swagger. But there was something different this time, something not so certain in his steps. Chuck didn't flinch. He didn't wait for the man to reach them. With slow deliberation, Chuck turned toward him, his gaze unwavering, as if the very air around him was demanding respect. And then Chuck did something unexpected. He moved. Not a word, no threat, no warning. Just a single, calculated step forward, his body perfectly still yet full of purpose. The shift in the air was immediate. The young man, who had been so confident moments ago, faltered in his tracks, his grin fading as Chuck's silent movement seemed to stop everything. For a moment, there was no sound, no mocking, no laughter, only the weight of Chuck's presence as he took that single step. The young man paused, his bravado cracking as he stared at Chuck, unable to find the words to continue. It was the move that stopped it all, the shift in the balance, the quiet stand that spoke louder than any taunt could ever have. The crowd, once hesitant, now felt the change, and even the young man could no longer muster the courage to continue. He turned and walked away, without a word, and the power of silence hung in the air. The young man stood there for a moment, caught between the weight of his words and the undeniable calm of Chuck's presence. The confidence that had once fueled his bravado had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. He shifted on his feet, glancing around, but no one was there to back him up. The crowd, which had once fed off his energy, had fallen silent, waiting for the next move, but there would be no more theatrics. Chuck remained still, his posture unwavering. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a silence that seemed to fill the entire space around them, pressing in on the young man. Rick, too, watched, his hand still resting lightly on the wheels of his chair. The young man had been bold, rude, and dismissive, but now he was small in comparison to the quiet strength standing before him. After what felt like an eternity, the young man's shoulders slumped. The bravado was gone, replaced by a deep unease. His eyes flicked to the ground, then back up to Chuck. There was no more smirk, no defiance. Just a raw realization of how far he had crossed the line. The young man cleared his throat, his voice faltering as he struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry. That was uncalled for." The apology hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, everyone waiting to see if the young man would truly follow through or retreat into his old ways. Chuck's gaze softened slightly, but he didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between them had already conveyed everything. The young man's apology was a quiet acknowledgement of the power in restraint, in standing tall without ever having to raise a fist. The young man shifted on his feet, nodding before turning to leave, his steps slower now, more measured. Rick sat back in his chair, his heart lighter than it had been all day. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to defend himself. The apology wasn't just for him. It was for the understanding that had been reached without a single word. Rick watched as the young man walked away, his steps now unsure, the swagger gone. The entire coffee shop seemed to exhale a collective breath, as if the tension that had clung to the air was finally lifted. There were no cheers, no loud applause, just the quiet realization that something significant had just happened. The young man's apology was more than just a few mumbled words. It was a shift, an acknowledgement of something deeper. Rick sat still, his hands resting lightly on his lap. For a moment, he didn't move. He wasn't sure what to feel. There was a strange sense of calm settling over him, but also something else, a quiet realization that the events of the day had changed him in ways he hadn't expected. He had spent so long trying to prove himself, to show others that he was more than the soldier who came back broken. For so long, he had internalized the mockery, the pity, the judgment. He had allowed their words to define him, to shape how he saw himself. But now something had shifted. In the span of a few minutes, he had gone from the target of cruel jokes to someone who had been silently acknowledged, not by words, but by the quiet strength of Chuck's presence and the unexpected apology that followed. Rick's eyes followed the young man, now at the door, but his thoughts weren't on him anymore. They were on himself, on how he had stood firm without raising his voice, without a single word, and yet had come out of the situation unscathed, with a sense of peace he had never known. The apology wasn't just for him. It was a recognition that his strength didn't lie in his ability to fight back, but in his decision not to. For the first time in a long time, Rick felt a quiet pride in who he was. It wasn't about the leg, the wheelchair, or the scars. It was about the man he had become, the one who had found strength not in defiance, but in silence. The impact on Rick wasn't just that he had survived the moment. It was that for the first time he felt truly free. The air around them seemed to settle, the city's noise creeping back into the space as the young man disappeared into the distance. The coffee shop resumed its rhythm, but there was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, like the day had somehow been rewritten in those brief moments. People were returning to their own conversations, their own routines, but the energy had changed. Rick could feel it, but the person who had made it all happen was already preparing to leave. Chuck stood up slowly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He hadn't said much throughout the encounter, but his presence had said it all. Rick had noticed the way people responded to him, not with awe or excitement, but with respect. It was the kind of respect that didn't need to be earned with grand gestures. It was earned by simply being who you were and standing firm. Chuck adjusted his jacket with a calm, practiced ease, his eyes scanning the quiet space one last time. He didn't look back at Rick, but Rick felt the weight of the moment as Chuck began walking toward the door. There was something almost cinematic about it. The way the crowd parted slightly, the subtle way people acknowledged him with their glances. But Chuck didn't seem to notice. He didn't need to. Rick's gaze lingered on him as he made his way out, his footsteps soft on the wooden floor. He hadn't said goodbye, but then there was no need. Chuck had given him everything he needed with just a few gestures, a few moments of silence. He had shown Rick what true strength was, how to face the world without flinching, how to stand firm without saying a word. As the door swung closed behind Chuck, the soft chime barely audible over the noise of the coffee shop, Rick sat back, a sense of peace washing over him. He hadn't been left alone. Not really. In the quiet aftermath, Rick realized that Chuck's exit wasn't a departure at all. It was a final lesson, one that would stay with him long after the door had closed. And with that, Chuck was gone, leaving Rick to walk the path he had shown him. The coffee shop was slowly returning to its usual bustle, the hum of conversations picking back up, the clinking of mugs, and the low murmur of the barista's chatter filling the air. But Rick wasn't part of it, not completely. He sat quietly in his wheelchair, his gaze unfocused as his mind replayed the events of the morning, trying to piece together the shift that had occurred. The young man's apology still echoed in Rick's mind, but it wasn't the apology itself that lingered. It was the way the room had changed, the way people had reacted. Something had shifted in the air, and it wasn't just the young man who had left. The entire space felt different. There was a quiet understanding in the way people moved around him now, like they saw him differently, like they saw him as more than just a broken soldier in a wheelchair. He glanced around the coffee shop, at the patrons who had been witnesses to the scene, and he noticed something he hadn't seen before. They weren't looking at him with pity or discomfort anymore. There were no whispers behind his back, no awkward glances. Instead, there was a sense of respect, something that wasn't earned through words or gestures, but through the silence that had spoken louder than anything else. It was as though the power of the moment had subtly redefined how they saw him, not as a victim, but as a man who had stood tall in the face of mockery and stood his ground without ever lifting a fist. The weight of it all pressed gently on Rick's chest, a quiet satisfaction filling him. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the ripple effect that would follow Chuck's silent intervention. The apology wasn't just for him. It had shifted the way people thought, the way they viewed strength and resilience. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about choosing to live with integrity, regardless of the world's assumptions. As the last of the customers trickled out and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Rick remained there, the weight of the day sinking in. He was different now, and so was everything around him. Rick sat in the quiet aftermath of the day, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of his wheelchair. The world had moved on, the noise of the coffee shop now fading into the background, but he remained still, processing the weight of everything that had happened. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of calm, of peace. For so long, he had carried a quiet anger with him, the kind that simmered under the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. But now that anger seemed so distant, like a shadow from a past life. What had happened today had shifted something deep within him, and he couldn't quite put it into words. He wasn't just thankful for Chuck's intervention, though that had been more than he could have ever hoped for. It was the way Chuck had shown him something far greater, the ability to stand firm without a single word, to let his actions speak louder than any words could. Rick had spent years fighting, physically and emotionally, to prove his worth, to show that he was more than the man in the wheelchair, more than the soldier who had lost so much. But today, he realized that proving his worth wasn't about force. It wasn't about pushing back. It was about owning who he was, standing firm in the face of ridicule, and choosing to walk forward, not with a clenched fist, but with the quiet strength that came from within. His thoughts wandered to the young man who had apologized. The moment had been brief, but profound. It wasn't just an apology. It was an acknowledgement, not just of Rick's strength, but of the power that lay in silence, in resilience. And in that apology, Rick felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. Not sympathy, not pity, but a genuine recognition of who he was. A soft smile tugged at Rick's lips as he looked out the window, watching the last of the daylight fade. The world around him had changed, and so had he. And for the first time in a long time, Rick felt truly grateful, not for what he had lost, but for what he had gained: peace, dignity, and the quiet confidence that came from standing tall without saying a word. The following days unfolded with a quiet intensity that Rick had never expected. It wasn't just that the world had seemed to shift around him in the coffee shop, but the subtle changes that followed began to resonate with him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he moved through his daily routine, there was something different in the way people looked at him. It was as if the very air had shifted. What was once filled with judgment or uncertainty now seemed to hum with something deeper, something more real. The young man who had mocked him was gone, and Rick had been left with more than just his apology. He had been left with something unexpected: respect. A newfound respect, not just from others, but from himself. It was in the way people greeted him now. Quick nods, brief glances, even polite smiles, as though they recognized something in him that had always been there, but had been buried beneath layers of doubt and anger. They didn't see a man in a wheelchair anymore. They saw someone who had stood his ground without raising his voice, someone who had quietly earned his place not through confrontation, but through resilience. Rick had spent years thinking that his worth was something to prove to others. But now, he understood that it wasn't about them at all. It wasn't about winning anyone over or forcing them to see him the way he wanted them to. It was about respecting himself enough to stand firm, to own his place in the world without needing anyone else's approval. Chuck's influence lingered, like a shadow that moved with him through every moment of quiet strength. It wasn't just that Chuck had intervened for him. It was the way he had lived in that moment, the way he had shown Rick how to carry that same quiet power with him, no matter where he went. And in doing so, Chuck had given Rick a gift he hadn't known he needed: a sense of belonging that came from within, a respect for himself that no one else could take away. As Rick wheeled himself down the street, he smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting. For the first time, he didn't feel like he had something to prove. He simply felt whole. The coffee shop, once a place of fleeting exchanges and unnoticed faces, had become something more in the days that followed the incident. It wasn't just the physical space that had changed. The furniture, the decor, the quiet hum of customers drinking their coffee. No, it was the atmosphere, the energy that now seemed to radiate from the walls, a subtle transformation that couldn't be ignored. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. People who came in no longer spoke in hushed tones about their daily routines, their complaints, their little grievances. Instead, there was a quiet respect that lingered in the air, as if everyone knew something important had happened, even if they hadn't fully understood it. The atmosphere had softened, as though the space itself had absorbed the weight of the morning's events, and in doing so, it had become a little more intentional, a little more present. It wasn't just Rick who noticed it. The barista, who had always been quick to offer a distracted smile, now seemed to greet everyone with a deeper sincerity. The older couple who sat by the window every day, once wrapped in their own world, now exchanged knowing glances when someone looked Rick's way, their smiles almost protective. Even the owner, a quiet man who had never taken much interest in the comings and goings of his patrons, found himself watching Rick with a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement. It was as if, in one brief moment, the coffee shop had become a place where everyone had witnessed something extraordinary. Chuck's brief presence in the shop had left a ripple, one that extended far beyond the moment of tension. The young man's apology had acted like a catalyst, not just for Rick, but for everyone who had been there. It was as though the collective energy of the space had been recalibrated, shifting from a place of judgment to one of understanding. For Rick, the change was evident in the way people now treated him. There were no more awkward glances, no more whispers behind his back. He no longer felt like an outsider in the coffee shop. He was simply part of it, part of the transformation that had unfolded in those brief, quiet moments. The coffee shop had become a reflection of him, calm, steady, and unbreakable. The days drifted by in a quiet rhythm, and Rick's life, once marked by conflict and hesitation, had found a new pace. The world outside continued its busy cycle, but there was a calmness in him now, a sense of resolve that hadn't been there before. He no longer sought approval, no longer craved the validation that had once seemed so important. What mattered now was the quiet strength he had discovered within himself, the kind that didn't need to be seen or heard, just felt. Chuck had come into his life like a fleeting breeze, with no fanfare, no dramatic speeches. He had walked in with the quiet power of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to give. In that moment in the coffee shop, Chuck had shown Rick that true strength wasn't about reacting to the noise of the world. It was about remaining steady, unshaken, no matter the circumstances. It was a lesson that Rick carried with him every day, even when Chuck had disappeared from his life, leaving behind only the echo of his presence. Rick had started to make small changes in his life. He no longer avoided the glances, the whispers, or the moments that once made him feel invisible. Instead, he walked into rooms with a quiet confidence, his posture straight, his head held high, not because he needed anyone to notice, but because he noticed himself. In his mind, the image of the young man who had apologized played over and over, not as a symbol of weakness, but of change. It was a mark of something deeper, a recognition that even the loudest voices could be silenced by the strength of one's own presence. The coffee shop had become more than just a place to stop for a cup of coffee. It had become a part of his legacy, a place where the quiet moments of his life were marked not by the noise, but by the lasting effect of a single lesson learned. Chuck had left, but the legacy of his silent strength remained in the way Rick lived his life now. It wasn't about the loud victories, the moments of glory. It was in the quiet, consistent presence that spoke louder than words ever could.